In the grim darkness of the far future, there are no heroes left untouched by blood. Every oath is bought with suffering, every prayer is sharpened into a weapon, every whisper in the dark demands a price greater than life itself. Among the shadows of shattered hives and forsaken manufactoria, there are those who kneel not to the God-Emperor of mankind, but to powers older, hungrier, and infinitely crueler. To live as a chaos cultist is not simply to betray one's species, it is to carve out your soul and offer it, screaming to the warp. Their existence is a paradox, hunted by the Imperium, devoured by their masters, yet too desperate to turn back. And so their cursed path stretches onward, step by step into damnation, as both pawn and offering in the eternal war that consumes the galaxy. If the shadows of this universe pull you closer, if the secrets of forbidden devotion and eternal corruption intrigue you, then walk deeper with us. Subscribe to the channel, share this journey with others, and add your voice to those who refuse to look away from the truths the Imperium dares not speak. The warp is vast, and together we can map its echoes. Asterisk, the Manufactorum never truly sleeps. Even when the great furnaces gutter low, and the shift bells toll their hollow warning. The air trembles with the ghosts of motion, with the echo of pistons and the hiss of promethium lines cooling in their veins. It is a place where the body learns to move without thought, where the heart's beat is lost against the hammer of gears. The men and women who labor here are less than shadows. Shapes smudged by soot, their faces hidden beneath rebreather masks crusted with black residue. They are flesh asked to mimic servitors, but their hands shake, their lungs burn. Their eyes flicker with exhaustion that machines will never know. They are commanded to outpace the perfect rhythm of steel. And in failing, they bleed their worth into silence. The stench is impossible to escape. Oily smoke seeps into skin, into hair, into marrow itself, until even the act of breathing tastes of rust and charred iron. Every inhalation is an injury. Every exhalation, a surrender. The heat clings not only to the skin, but to the spirit, pressing down like the Emperor's gaze-inless, unyielding, suffocating. Yet no prayer is spoken aloud, they are muttered. Instead, behind vox grills clogged with dust, fragmented into syllables too broken to hear. Perhaps it is fear that stills their tongues, or perhaps the rituals have grown too tired to reach Terra. When the machinery halts, it is worse. Silence blooms not as relief, but as a kind of violence, pressing on the ears until it seems the skull itself might crack. Without the constant churn of cogs and the lash of overseers' whips, every worker feels the enormity of their solitude. They belong to no one but the darkness, and the darkness is not kind. It listens. It waits. The silence is not absence, but presence, filling every crevice of the Manufactorum with something unseen. In that stillness, shadows stretch too far. The cogitator screens, cracked and flickering, seem to breathe on their own, light fluttering like the pulse of some wounded beast. A smear of green static hisses across one display, therefore a heartbeat. Gone the next, yet leaving the impression of a pattern, a face, an eye half glimpsed. The workers know better than to stare. Curiosity is dangerous. Questions invite punishment. And yet, when the day's labors have stripped them of strength, the mind finds no defense against intrusion. Dreams creep in where reason falters, and the silence becomes a canvas on which forbidden thoughts are painted. One man, his name irrelevant to the overseers. But once he had a mother who whispered it as prayer leans against a rust-slick pillar when the bell releases him. His palms are raw, skin split where metal bit too deep, and the ache in his shoulders hums like a second heartbeat. He should be moving, should be dragging himself back to the dormitory before the next cycle, but his steps falter. The silence feels heavier here, clinging to him like damp cloth, and beneath it there is something else. Vibration, perhaps no. More than the pulse of the cooling pipes, yet he feels it, not in his ears, but in his bones. It comes again, softer now, threading through his fatigue like smoke. Not words, not yet, but the suggestion of words, the shape of a thought that is not his own. His breath catches. He turns, searching the dark, but no one is there. The others shuffle past, heads bowed, too broken to notice. He tells himself, it is nothing. The manufactorum is old, its pipes older still. The air carries strange echoes. And yet, the thought lingers. It's not sound, but suggestion, a whisper that coils in the hollow places of his mind. It does not command, not openly. It waits, patient as rust, feeding on uncertainty. He tastes iron at the back of his throat, though he has not bitten his tongue. He blinks against the sting of smoke, though no fire burns nearby. For the first time in cycles uncounted, he feels watched, not by the overseers, not by the emperor's distant gaze, but by something closer, something that breathes in step with his own lungs. He closes his eyes. The half-second before sleep takes him on his feet, he hears it again clearer now, intimate as a secret pressed against the ear. A word he cannot repeat once he wakes. A word that does not belong to him. When his eyes open, the dormitory has swallowed him whole.
Ow.
The workers lie in rows, their rebreathers hissing in rhythm, a parody of prayer. Yet his heart beats faster, as if he has stolen something sacred, as if a hand has brushed the veil of his soul. He does not speak. He does not move. But he knows whether dream or madness that he has heard something not meant for mortal ears. And in the silence, it waits for him to answer. The descent into the underhive is less a journey than a surrender. You do not walk there so much as fall, dragged downward by corridors that narrow into chasms of rust and stone, where the light grows thin and the walls sweat with toxins. The air is a poison that seeps through filters and gnaws at lungs until every breath becomes a wound. Here water is not drawn from fountains or pipes, but bartered in scrip, measured in thimblefuls, guarded more fiercely than life itself. Hunger is a constant companion, a weight gnawing the belly until pain itself becomes familiar, even comforting in its regularity. In the underhive, survival is not living. It is the art of postponing death. Faces blur in this twilight world, their features stripped away by shadow and grime. A child might pass you with eyes too old for their years, a scavenger crouched at a rusted grate with fingers raw from clawing at the scraps that fall through. Their ribs show like the struts of broken hab-blocks, yet still they move relentless, as though sheer will might defy the cruelty of the hive. A lumen strip flickers above, casting everything in pale green haze. And for a heartbeat it seems less like light and more like the mockery of hope itself. Here, rations of promethium are counted like coins of faith. A man's worth is measured not by loyalty, not by blood, not even by skill, but by how many hours of fuel he can claim. Burners must be fed, or the cold will kill faster than thirst. Even whispers of warmth carry power, drawing the desperate like moths to a flame that will consume them whole. It is in this economy of ruin that something else begins to stir, something that does not trade in fuel or food, but in presence. At first, it is a feeling, a sense that someone is watching, though the alleys are empty. A shadow that lingers a fraction too long. A chill that settles not in the body but in the marrow. Some name it madness, others starvation's trick, yet all feel it. The certainty that, in a place long abandoned, they are finally seen. And what they feel in that gaze is not pity nor scorn, but attention. For the forgotten, that alone is dangerous mercy. Rumors take root quickly here, carried on vox static, that shouldn't exist, faint syllables breaking through the hiss of dead channels. A traitor swears they heard a voice speaking their name through a broken receiver. A gang of youths mark walls with symbols they cannot translate, strokes to fluid, too alive to have been carved by human hands. The overseers dismiss it as underhive delusion, but the workers whisper otherwise. They whisper that it listens, that it answers. Every corridor begins to wear its mark. Graffiti etched into ferrocrete, curling into sigils that resemble eyes. Mouths, chains or none of these, depending on how the light falls. The desperate. Trace them with filthy fingers, not understanding, yet unable to look away. Each mark promises something unnamed, something vast. To be noticed, to be acknowledged, even by something monstrous. Feels like deliverance compared to the silence of the Imperium, where prayers vanish into the void and no reply comes. A mother bends over her child's fevered body and whispers into the dark. Not a plea to the emperor, but to the presence she cannot name. Her words falter, broken, yet she swears she feels heat rise from the stone, as if an ear pressed close to listen. A drunk swears he heard his own laugh echo back to him, though none had joined in. In hunger, in sickness, in despair, the whisper grows louder, shaping itself into something intimate, not command, not demand. Recognition. One night beneath a lumen-stripped bleeding green light, a gaunt figure stands apart from the crowd. His skin clings to bone, his lips cracked, his voice little more than dust. And yet when he speaks, the sound carries farther than it should, rippling through the narrow passageways. The phrase is strange, a sequence of syllables no one remembers teaching him. His throat strains with each attempt, the words clawing their way free as though rehearsed in dreams not his own. The crowd freezes. The air holds still. His voice trembles, cracking on the final sound, but he repeats it again and again until it no longer sounds like a stranger's tongue, but a prayer learned long ago. A prayer in a language no one should know, and from the silence, something listens. War does not end for the Astra Militarum. It only shifts shape, one theater bleeding into the next until time itself dissolves into campaigns that no soldier can name. The veterans no longer count years but scars, each wound a tally etched into flesh. Proof that they have endured where others dissolved into ash, desert heat choking and blinding. Hive spires collapsing under orbital bombardment, jungles that devour men whole, their roots slick with blood. Every world is different, yet every battle tastes the same urine in the mouth, smoke in the lungs. The certainty that death is never more than a heartbeat away. Their banners fly, stitched with the imperial aquila, carried forward as symbols of glory. But in the eyes of the rank and file, they have grown brittle, like parchment too long left to the sun. They are not shields. They are reminders of how fragile belief has become. Commissars walk among them, voices clipped and hard, promising duty, sacrifice, honor. Their words fall like rounds into mud, swallowed before they can leave a mark. The soldiers nod, as they must. But in their silence, they trade truths that no officer would dare speak. They whisper of futility, reinforcements that never arrive, orders sent into the void, unanswered. Vox operators tune their sets and hear only the hiss of dead channels, the hollow static where salvation should be. Silence has become the true language of the Imperium, and it is in that silence that something else begins to breathe. The first contact does not come with fire or storm. It comes in a dream. A trooper, skin blistered from desert sun, closes his eyes to a sleep so shallow it feels like drowning. In that fragile darkness, he sees not the emperor bound to the golden throne, a husk sustained by sacrifice, but a figure radiant and whole, striding free across the stars. The golden light does not blind, it warms, filling every hollow the years of war have carved inside him. This figure does not demand obedience, nor kneeling, nor the surrender of self. It extends a hand not in command, but in promise. Not of peace, that word has long since withered, but of vengeance. When he wakes, his breath shudders in his chest. He tells no one. To confess would be to die before a commissar's bolt pistol, skull shattered for the crime of seeing too much. And yet the dream refuses to dissolve. It lingers on his skin like sweat, in his ears like an echo. Forbidden, yes, but it carries the flavor of something truer than the catechisms he has mouthed since youth. What is faith, he wonders, if it offers only chains? What is heresy, if it delivers the promise of retribution? Night after night the dream returns, growing sharper. The golden figure does not fade, but strides nearer, its gaze pulling him forward. His comrades notice the tremor in his hands, the hollow fire in his stare, but they say nothing. Every soldier is breaking in some way, and his fracture is easier to ignore than most. Yet alone, by the guttering light of a dying lumen, he cannot resist. He kneels by his cot, dragging a finger through the dirt floor, tracing the shape that the dream has left seared into him. At first, it resembles the aquila of the wings, the symmetry. But then the lines curve too far, flowing into arcs that spiral inward, older, darker. It feels alive beneath his touch, as if the dirt itself remembers the shape. His hand trembles. His breath falters. When he finishes, he cannot name what he has drawn, only that it is not imperial. It is not sanctioned. And yet, staring at it, he feels something he has not felt since his first battle. Before hope had been beaten out of him, certainty, the sigil gleams faintly in the gloom. Alien yet intimate, pulsing with a rhythm he cannot explain. He presses his palm to it as though sealing a pact, and in the silence that follows, he dares to believe he is no longer forgotten. The manufactorum had many dead places, rooms left to rot when the machines within them finally failed. Chambers the overseers abandoned as unprofitable. Their walls blackened with soot, and their floors layered with dust so thick it muffled every step. It was in one such hollow that the first gathering took place. Not planned, not summoned, at least not openly. It was as if the silence itself had drawn them here, gravity invisible but undeniable, pulling the forgotten into one orbit. The air was damp, sour with mildew, and the walls dripped with condensation that carried the stink of rust. Yet in that place, where the hum of industry had been stripped away, something breathed. They came alone at first. A man with scars across his knuckles, a woman whose cough betrayed lungs ruined by years of promethium smoke, a youth with eyes too wide to belong to any child who had lived long in the hive. Each of them thought themselves mad for answering a summons never spoken, yet none turned away. Their boots scuffed softly against stone, their breaths shallow and quick. And when their eyes met, the flicker of recognition passed between them like a spark. Not friendship. Not yet. But the shock of knowing that the whisper had reached others. The room was lit only by candles, their wax spilling down in crooked rivulets, pooling like pale blood on the floor. The flames sputtered against the damp air, yet never died. Leaning always toward the center of the chamber, as if drawn by a draft too subtle to feel on the skin, smoke curled upward in threads, not dispersing as it should, but climbing in straight lines, as though guided by some unseen breath. And there was incense, burned in cracked brass censers, scavenged from a shrine long abandoned. Its sweetness coated the tongue, cloying, making the air thick enough to chew. With every inhalation, their bodies seemed to grow heavier, but their minds strangely felt lighter. No one spoke at first. Words carried risk, and silence had become their shield. They stood apart, ringed around the candles, their faces half veiled with hoods or scraps of cloth. To see another's features fully was to endanger them both. But in the hush, the air trembled with the weight of unspoken things. Each knew the others had heard it too, that voice, that intrusion, that impossible presence. Each knew they had carried it here like a wound and found, to their wonder, it was shared. When the first voice broke the quiet, it was little more than a whisper itself. Not a name, not a confession, but a sound shaped by longing. Others followed, low, uncertain, each syllable fractured, as if their tongues resisted forming the thoughts aloud. The words were not Imperial Gothic, nor any dialect of the hive they knew, but something older, heavier, falling awkward from human mouths. And yet, even broken, the cadence carried. The sound shivered in the stone, echoed off the soot-stained walls, gathered strength until it became something more than sound-resonance. They did not need to be taught. Each phrase seemed already buried in memory, as if remembered rather than learned. One began, faltered, then another took up the strain. Soon the chamber was filled with a low murmur, uneven, fragile, yet undeniable. They felt it in their chests, in the spaces between their ribs, in the marrow of their bones. The chant resisted them. Yes, it twisted in the mouth like something alive, recoiled against clumsy tongues. But it did not stop. For the first time in lives spent bowed under labor and silence, they were not alone. The relief of it was intoxicating, almost holy, and yet every moment carried unease. They knew they stood on the edge of something vast and terrible, and none could name what lay beyond. But they also knew that turning away would mean returning to solitude, to the void of being unseen, unheard, unloved by the Imperium they had bled for. And so they leaned closer to the flame, closer to one another, voices weaving into something larger than themselves. The chant swelled, not yet harmonious, not yet whole, but enough to make the air quiver. Shadows deepened in the corners, lengthening where no light touched. For an instant, each could swear they felt the presence draw nearer, pressing close as though listening with rapt attention. Their skins prickled. Their hearts raced. The words were alien, but the feeling was not. It was belonging. And then, together, they began again louder this time, though the syllables scraped their throats raw. The sound was jagged, uneven, as if the words themselves resisted being spoken, but they spoke them anyway. At first, the gatherings were tentative things, cloaked in secrecy and doubt. But secrecy has a way of sharpening hunger. Each meeting pressed deeper, dared more, until hesitation itself became unbearable. The candles burned hotter, their flames guttering as if starved of air, and the stone walls drank in the heat until they glowed faintly with sweat. They began to cut their palms, shallow at first, blades trembling with inexperience, the blood offered in drops. But ritual has a gravity, and each drop seemed to demand another, till crimson pooled in shallow bowls, reflecting the flames in trembling ripples. The scent of iron filled the room, metallic and sweet, coating tongues and nostrils alike, impossible to ignore. Symbols carved themselves into the stone through their hands, crude at first, little more than scratches. Yet the more they traced, the more the lines seemed to guide them, bending their wrists into curves too fluid for human memory. Each mark glistened in the firelight, shadows clinging to the grooves as if reluctant to leave. They laughed nervously then, half drunk on fear, half dazzled by the audacity of what they did. Laughter was safer than admitting the truth, that they all felt something watching. But laughter faltered the first time a wound closed too swiftly. A man gashed his palm, deeper than intended, and before their eyes the blood welled, stilled. And the skin knit itself with unnatural speed. No one spoke, but every gaze turned to him, to the smooth flesh where there should have been scar. He stammered excuses, muttered about clean cuts and tricks of the light, but his voice shook too hard to convince even himself. The chamber had gone to still. It was not trickery. It was intrusion, and then came the visions. At first, no more than flashes when eyelids shut, a smear of color, a burst of light like a forge flame. But they grew. Shapes began to emerge. Towers black against a sky choked with fire, oceans boiling into mist, and always, a figure half glimpsed at the horizon. Golden, radiant, striding free across the void, gaze fixed on them alone. When the first cultist gasped awake, eyes wet with tears, the others understood without a word. They had seen too. They had walked the same corridors of dream. The air grew thick in those chambers. Heavy with smoke from offerings burned until the stones themselves exhaled it back. They brought scraps to sacrifice, cloth, relics, food too precious to waste, but once the flames took them, the air shifted. It was no longer smoke. It was meaning. Every breath felt laden, as though their lungs had been filled with words not yet spoken. It pressed at them, urged them onward, deeper into the rhythm of chant, deeper into the current that surged unseen. Fear began to slip away. Not because danger lessened, but because danger itself had become intoxicating. Their voices rose, uneven, cracking, but with each repetition, the chant grew easier. The syllables no longer resisted them. They bent their tongues into shapes older than Terra, as though rediscovering something buried, not inventing anew. Each phrase tasted of ash, of copper, of salt, each sound dragging shivers down spines. And still they craved more. It was not without cost. Their eyes burned after each ritual. Their dreams no longer belonged to them alone. And silence became unbearable in the hours between meetings. Yet none turned back. All mixed with dread, and in that mingling lay the truth. What they touched was not illusion. It was power, raw and demanding, patient as rust, inexorable as gravity. They had been invisible their whole lives, forgotten by the Imperium, unseen even by the Emperor they bled for. But here they were seen. And being seen was enough to devour their fear. One night, as the chant reached its peak, the circle swayed together, voices rasping, until throats grew raw. Shadows writhed on the walls, stretching too far, twisting into shapes that should not have fit the chamber. Then, without warning, a figure in the circle convulsed. His body bent backward, spine arching so violently his hood fell away. Eyes rolled white in their sockets, lips quivering before words erupted from his throat. They were not his words, not any words the cult had spoken. They were jagged, fluid, spilling like molten glass, ancient syllables no mortal tongue should have borne. The room froze. Candles guttered. Every heart staggered as one thought surged through the circle. It was speaking through him. The air was heavy, thick with the reek of burning oils and the metallic sting of old blood that clung to the stone-like memory. At first, the rituals had been laughter and daring. A rebellion against silence and insignificance. A way to spit in the face of the Imperium's endless commands. But now, kneeling in the circle of wavering light, I felt something else. Not freedom. Not fellowship. Each word that left my mouth seemed less like a prayer and more like a surrender. Each chant hammered into place like a rivet in my own shackles. We had bound ourselves to the rhythm, to the unseen cadence that threaded through the room. And when the fire hissed in its brazier, I could almost hear it breathing back. At the start, we had called one another brothers, sisters, comrades. Now the titles shifted. Leaders arose, voices sharpened and burnished by the weight of something none of us could name. They spoke with certainty where the rest of us faltered, their words carrying a cadence that did not feel human. And we obeyed. Not because we trusted them. Not because they were chosen, but because when they spoke, the air thickened and our bodies bent forward of their own accord, like stalks before a storm. I wondered if they even remembered who they had been before their tongues had become instruments of something far older. Fear coiled inside me, winding tight beneath my ribs. Yet fear was no longer simple. It was braided with a strange devotion, indistinguishable from hunger. When I closed my eyes, images came not mine, not dreams, but glimpses of futures I had no right to see. A field of ash stretching to the horizon, a sky split by wings of bronze, a figure of light with its face hidden in shadow. Each vision was a thread hooked through me, tugging me closer, binding me even as I recoiled. It should have sickened me, but it didn't. It thrilled. It hollowed me out and filled me with something that wasn't my own. Even silence no longer belonged to us. It lingered like a presence, as if the very air was listening, waiting, judging. A pause in the chants felt heavier than the words themselves, as if absence was just another form of submission. I caught myself holding my breath, afraid that even the sound of lungs working might be taken as defiance. Around me, the others swayed in rhythm, their eyes unfocused, their lips mouthing words even after the chorus had ended. We were not a circle anymore. We were a chain, each link forged from surrender. There were moments, fleeting but sharp, when I remembered who I had been before the rituals alone, angry, scorned by the commissars who demanded devotion to a throne I could never see. That memory should have anchored me. Instead, it only made the chains feel more welcome. Better to be bound among the chosen than to rot as another nameless body in the Emperor's wars. That was the thought that tightened the links that dressed surrender in the disguise of ecstasy. If the Imperium called obedience holy, was this truly so different? Only here, I felt alive. Tonight, the room seemed to lean in closer. Shadows crawled on the walls in patterns that didn't belong to the flames. My skin itched as though the air itself was riding on me. I looked down, intending to scratch at the irritation, and froze. My hands lay in my lap, palms upward. On the skin, black lines coiled into shapes I did not recognize, inked deep as though they had been carved into me. I had no memory of the touch, no pain, no needle, no moment of inscription. Yet there it was, a sigil shifting beneath the candlelight, its curves alive, pulsing faintly as if it drank the shadows around it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to laugh. Both urges tangled in my throat and left me silent. The mark moved again, curling into something older than the Aquila, a shape that should not have existed and yet was undeniably real. The fire guttered in the brazier, For an instant I swore the mark pulsed with the same rhythm as my own heart. I did not feel branded. I felt claimed, and I knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, that I had never been free at all. The candle sputtered, shadows twisting long across the stone. The mark on my skin shifted once more, curling into something unrecognizable, waiting to be named. The days blurred into one another, painted in the gray dust of the manufactorum and the stale air of Hablock corridors. To the eyes of those around me, I was no different from them, another bent figure in threadbare robes, another worker returning home to ration packs and sleep. My face wore the same fatigue, my voice carried the same monotone greetings, and my hands bore the same grime. Yet beneath that mask of routine, every heartbeat thudded louder than the hammering of the forges. Every breath tasted of iron and ash and fear. For though we had found one another, though the rituals had bound us, the city itself had begun to hunt us. It was impossible not to feel it. The Adeptus Arbits had tightened their patrols, heavy boots ringing against Ferrocrete, with a rhythm meant to remind us who owned every inch of this place. In the manufactorum, servitors dragged chains through corridors still echoing with sermons to the Emperor, while overhead vox grills hissed coded fragments warnings disguised as static, directives disguised as prayers. At first I thought it was paranoia, the echo of guilt in my skull. But the glances grew sharper. The pauses in conversation lengthened. Even the walls seemed alive, breathing in my secrets and exhaling suspicion into the ears of strangers at night. When I returned to the hollowed-out shrine where the others gathered, I found solace only in whispers. Candles guttered low, their flames painting every shadow with suspicion. Every flicker, a reminder of how fragile our sanctuary truly was. We murmured the chants under our breath, our voices no louder than the scrape of cloth against stone. The rituals had once felt like liberation. Now they were armor. Words and gestures repeated not out of joy, but out of desperate need, because in their rhythm lay the illusion that we were still unseen. I began to notice the changes in myself most keenly in the quiet moments, walking home after a shift. Every distant clang of steel against steel sounded like a signal. Every Arbite's patrol in the distance became the herald of my end. My mind replayed the same questions with every step. Had my glance lingered too long on the wrong person? Had my lips moved in silent prayer where someone might see? Even the taste of my ration bread seemed different. Grain turned bitter as though laced with the ash of betrayal not yet spoken aloud. Yet still, I clung to the gatherings. The fear was a noose, but the ritual was the rope I gripped with both hands. In the chants and the shared silence, I remembered that I was not alone, that we were bound together. Even if every day narrowed into the same unbearable choice, speak and risk discovery, or remain silent and rot alone. Was it courage to return again and again? Or was it madness, a hunger that outweighed the instinct for survival? I could not tell any more. The others bore the same strain, though we rarely admitted it. Faces were drawn tighter, laughter less frequent, shoulders hunched even in the safety of the shrine. Still, no one spoke of leaving. To walk away now would be to invite the very thing we feared most to be alone again, unseen but unguarded. Vulnerable to the weight of silence and the hollow stare of the Aquila carved above the manufactorum gates. Better the hunt with fellowship at my side than the emptiness of obedience. One night, as we whispered the words that had carried us through so many evenings, the air changed. A heaviness descended, pressing against skin and lungs, stifling even the flame of the brazier. I thought at first it was another vision, some intrusion from the unseen realm. But then I heard it, the measured rhythm of boots striking stone, heavy, deliberate, drawing closer. Each step echoed through the chamber walls as though carried by the bones of the hive itself. My pulse surged. No one spoke. No one dared breathe louder than a sigh. The boots stopped. Right outside, the silence was worse than the sound. Every muscle in my body clenched, every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber's single candle guttered, flame bending sideways, as if shrinking back from what waited beyond the door. In that instant, I understood that the rituals, the whispers, the chains of secrecy, all of it, had led us here. To this breathless moment between discovery and annihilation, the boots shifted once, grinding against stone. The sound scraped through my skull like a blade, and then nothing, only the candle flame, shivering on the edge of extinction. As if it too feared what waited in the dark. The hunt did not begin with fanfare. It began with silence. Entire hablocks where the windows once glowed with faint lumen light suddenly darkened, doors sealed, records erased, as if those who lived there had never drawn breath. The administratum filed their names away under structural failure or plague outbreak, but we knew better. The Inquisition had turned its gaze upon the hive, and once that gaze fell, it never blinked. I remember the first sweep. Sirens howled, not as warnings, but as dirges. Adeptus Arbits marched in precise formation through corridors, where even the dust held its breath. Their carapace armor gleamed with the harsh glow of lumen packs, and their shock mauls cracked against ferrocrete like the breaking of bones. Flanking them moved sanctioned psychers, their eyes milky and unfocused, lips twitching with words that reeked of ozone and copper. Nullrods sparked as they passed, arcing with the violence of caged lightning, each flare dragging unseen things screaming into silence. To the workers, they were saviors. To us, they were executioners. The Auspex scanners were worse. Their mechanical shrieks cut through Vox channels, stabbing into the ears of every man and woman within range. Once, I watched as an Arbits officer pressed a scanner against a manufacturing bulkhead. The machine howled, and a hidden shrine behind the wall combusted without flame. The sacred ash of our offerings curling up into smoke that carried our secrets into their armored visors. Nothing was safe. Not the words whispered into cloth-wrapped corners. Not the chants carved shallowly into rusted railings. Not even the sigh of breath we let escape in prayer. So we adapted. Survival became its own ceremony. We buried our shrines beneath ash pits, letting filth disguise devotion. We gutted old servitors, hollowing their bellies to hide the texts that had once guided our rituals, sealing them back up with rivets until they looked as mindless and broken as the others. We spoke in static, letting faulty lumen strips hum and flicker with patterns only we understood. Rhythms of faith disguised as mechanical failure. Each act carried risk, yet each act was demanded. To falter, even once, was to betray the unseen masters who had already marked us as theirs. But even these measures could not erase the fear. Every night I returned home to find another name absent from the Vox listings, another door sealed with the sigil of the Aquila scorched black upon it. Those who vanished were never spoken of again, as though their erasure itself was a contagion. Yet within the circle of candlelight, I could not banish the thought, when would my name be next? When would my door be the one sealed shut, my shadow erased as cleanly as if it had never fallen? The others whispered of agents cloaked in sanctioned fire, of interrogators whose eyes could see the lie in the curl of a lip or the twitch of a hand. Some said the inquisitors themselves never needed to speak, that their presence alone stripped the soul bare, that standing before them was to feel every hidden thought torn into daylight. Rumor, liturgy, madness, it made no difference. Belief itself was enough to turn sleep into torment. Yet still, I returned. Still, I knelt in silence and carved the forbidden sigils deeper into my palms, letting the blood run black beneath the guttering light. Because what choice remained? To stop was to betray. To turn away was to be consumed not by flame, but by emptiness. Better the fire than the void. One night, as we gathered in a forgotten access tunnel deep beneath the manufactorum, I felt the hunt closing tighter. The air stank of burned promethium and disinfectant, the unmistakable trace of Arbite's purge work. Our chants faltered, words swallowed by the hiss of recycled air. Then came the sound boots again, but these carried authority heavier than law. The Arbites advanced with torch beams slicing through the dark, each cone of light a blade against the shadows. One beam lingered, steady and merciless, upon a wall where we had tried to hastily, too imperfectly, to scrub a blood-stained mark from stone. The sigil was half gone, but not gone enough. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence pressed against our throats, thick as the moment before a bolt pistol fires. The walls closed in long before the Arbites breached them. Each day felt like walking a corridor, narrowing toward a vanishing point. one side lined with the banners of the Imperium, the other with shadows deeper than any lumen could cut. Between them, I moved as prey hunted by predator, yet also shackled by God. It was a truth I tasted in the metallic temps of recycled air. In the way my own pulse seemed to echo louder than footsteps in the dark, the Imperium demanded obedience. Chaos demanded surrender. And I, caught between, found that neither offered mercy. Survival itself became a kind of blasphemy. To breathe was to defy the arbits whose bolt pistols could erase me in a heartbeat. Yet to keep breathing was also to invite further demands from the voices that clawed behind my ribs. Each act of concealment scrubbing sigils from Ferrocrete, burning texts in Promethium-fueled furnaces, swallowing chants until my tongue bled was no longer merely survival. It was an offering. For every mark erased, another demanded to be carved deeper into flesh. For every word silenced, another whispered unbidden at the edge of sleep. What I thought was resistance revealed itself as submission in disguise. The cult had begun to shift under the pressure, its fragile fellowship mutating into something harsher, hungrier. Where once we gathered in candlelight, hands trembling as we dared speak forbidden syllables, now we gathered to bleed. Each meeting required a sacrifice, small at first, a drop of blood, a relic broken, a prayer whispered into flame. But small gestures soon seemed insufficient. The unseen masters demanded escalation. And escalation drew attention no concealment could mask. One night, a man I had once called brother was dragged into the circle, his wrists bound with frayed cable. He had faltered, they said, spoken too freely, looked too long at a passing Arbit's patrol. The air thickened as the decision was made. We were no longer worshippers but executioners, pressed into a role no one dared refuse. His cries mingled with the crackle of fire, and though my hands never touched the blade, the stink of burning flesh clung to me as surely as smoke. That night I realized survival was not freedom. It was proof of submission. And submission itself was a chain that tightened each time I drew breath. Meanwhile, the Imperium did not relent. Hive corridors thrummed with patrols. Auspex scanners shrieked their mechanical hunger. Psychers twitched as if tasting lies in the air itself. Entire Hablocks vanished, records sealed, families erased as though they had never existed. Yet still, the whispers found us. In the quiet after raids, as the echo of boots faded and the smell of disinfectant lingered, the voices pressed closer, not retreating but feeding on our fear. I could not tell if they protected us from discovery or delivered us into it. Perhaps both. At times I wondered which blade would cut first, the bolt pistol or the unseen hunger gnawing at my soul. To be caught was annihilation. To resist was betrayal. To obey was to be consumed. Futility draped itself over every hour, heavy as the ash-choked air of the manufactorum. And yet in that futility, something tightened its grip. The voices no longer asked. They commanded. They no longer whispered. They thundered in silence. Then came the night when the line blurred beyond repair. Huddled in a forgotten sublevel, we listened to static bleed through a battered Vox set, a relic so corroded we had long assumed it dead. At first, it was nothing but white noise, a hiss like wind tearing through broken glass. Then shapes in the sound, syllables, a cadence not imperial, yet carried on imperial channels. Impossible. I felt my stomach twist as recognition struck. The static resolved into a single forbidden sigil, its cadence seared into my bones. It was not heard, but felt, etched across every nerve like molten iron, even across the Emperor's domains. Across the chokehold of the Astronomicon, the Masters had found us. Their reach ignored distance, law, and silence. The Arbites might scour the hive clean. The Inquisition might erase our names from every ledger, but the truth was undeniable. We were never hiding. We were never free. Even in pursuit, we were already claimed, and as the Vox died back into static, I knew with a certainty colder than death, our escape was sealed before it ever began. The first signs come not as thunder, but as whispers beneath the skin. At first, it is dismissed as exhaustion, the body buckling under too many nights without rest, too many prayers spoken in the dark. But exhaustion does not leave heat radiating from beneath the flesh like embers refusing to die. Exhaustion does not make the veins glow faintly, as if something deeper than blood has begun to course through them. The cultists notice it in themselves, and then in one another. Subtle changes at first, then undeniable. What once felt like ecstasy chants answered in feverish visions. Dreams pierced by impossible clarity now carries a residue. Every revelation leaves a trace. Every invocation etches itself into muscle and marrow. At gatherings, they pretend nothing has changed. They bow, they chant, they spill their offerings, and taste the iron bite of blood on their tongues. But in the periphery, they steal glances. One's eye catches the lumen light too sharply, reflecting like wet glass. Another's breath steams, though the air is warm, each exhalation carrying the faint stink of burning promethium. They say nothing, for to speak is to acknowledge the truth that their bodies are no longer their own. They have become vessels, and vessels cannot choose their contents. The mind tries to clothe the horror with words of comfort. The saints of the ecclesiarchy suffer no less. One whispers to herself as she rubs her wrist where veins now pulse like threads of molten copper. Another claims in a voice made brittle by fear that this is proof of favor. The false emperor's champions bear scars and brands too. They cling to denial, weaving it into liturgy. Because to face it outright is to admit they are becoming more than human and less. Their flesh is unraveling into something unbound. In each day, the line grows thinner. The change carries sensations that cannot be ignored. Heat under the skin sharpens into pain that blossoms like a forge's flame, licking outward from bones to flesh. Hunger gnaws, but no food satisfies. Only blood thick with fear offers the faintest relief. Some dream in colors not known to mortal eyes, waking with tongues raw from biting down on screams. And still they gather, still they kneel, still they tell themselves it is holy. For if this is not a blessing, then it is a curse, and curses are for the damned. They cannot yet accept that they are already counted among them. But the body is not so easily lied to. One cultist, a youth with a voice once pure and ringing, finds his words splintering into tones not his own. When he prays, something prays through him, each syllable trailing echoes that are too deep, too sharp, too eager. Another sees her own reflection in a rusted panel. And the eyes that look back are not hers, they are watching, calculating as though the mirror has ceased to obey the laws of nature. In the corner of the manufactorum, where they meet, the smell of iron never leaves, even when no blood has been spilled. Shadows cling to the lumen strips, pooling thick where light should fall clean. Then comes the first fracture no one can deny. A young woman, her hands folded in silent prayer, lifts her gaze to the wall where her shadow should fall. At first it is there, cast neatly by the sputtering lumen light, but then it stirs. Slowly, deliberately. It curls its fingers, though hers remains still. It bows, though her head is upright, and then it looks at her not with eyes, but with a tilt of motion, a recognition that cannot be denied. Her breath catches in her throat, the air thick as oil. She dares not scream, dares not move, for in that instant she knows. Whatever has taken root inside her no longer lives only in her flesh. It has begun to step free. The lumen flickers. The shadow lingers. And when the light steadies again, she is left staring at the wall, trembling, praying it was a trick of the failing glow. But deep down, she knows the truth. The gift is burning, and it will not stop. They told themselves the pain was birthed, that each spasm and convulsion was a step closer to transcendence. And when the first of them rose, reshaped and terrible, it seemed as though their prayers had been answered. Flesh rippled into forms no craftsman could have sculpted, bone fusing into armor that gleamed as though slick with oil and blood. One man's torso split wide to reveal a mouth that stretched from collarbone to navel, a cavern of teeth and shrieking song that carried praises no vox grill could have amplified. The sound shook the manufactorum walls, rattling lumen strips until sparks rained from above. Those who heard it fell to their knees, half in devotion, half in terror, because it was the sound of something more than human and less. Yet where one rose, another fell. The body of a faithful sister dissolved before their eyes, her flesh sagging like wax near a flame. Bones softened, bending inward, until her frame collapsed upon itself in a wet implosion of skin and fluid. She still murmured prayers, even as her lips dissolved into the slurry, whispers bubbling through liquefied lungs until the voice faded altogether. The cultists watched and shuddered, choking on the sickly sweet reek that clung to their throats, realizing that the path to glory was paved with rot, and not all of them would cross it standing. The exalted did not weep for the fallen. Their eyes, too many, or too few, or none at all, burned with the light of something alien, something triumphant. They raised their warped limbs in benediction, singing in chords that resonated through the marrow of every listener. The cultists wept at the beauty and horror braided into those notes, knowing that within them lay the truth of chaos, the gift and the curse, inseparable, inseverable. Ascension for one was annihilation for another, and none could predict who would rise and who would collapse into carrion. It became a lottery of flesh. Each prayer, each offering, was made with hands that trembled not out of doubt in the gods, but from the certainty that faith alone could not decide their fate. Envy and terror coiled together in every heart. To see a brother rise as a vessel of living power filled them with awe. But beneath the awe festered a secret wish. Let it be me next. To watch a sister crumple into a muttering heap of biomass, twitching as though still begging for notice, forced them to face the other possibility. In chaos, there were no guarantees. Only chance, or perhaps some cruel amusement played out by unseen hands. And yet none turned away. Not one, for to turn away was worse than to fall, worse than to rot. To turn away was to betray the covenant and be cast out into the waiting jaws of the Inquisition. Better to die liquefying in the shadow of glory than to burn screaming beneath the torches of the Adeptus Arbites. And so they knelt, trembling, watching as the exalted grew taller and the forsaken sank lower. Their faith bound not by choice, but by inevitability. The spectacle of it pressed on them with the force of revelation. This was the truth of devotion stripped bare, all pretense torn away. The gods did not promise fairness. They promised nothing but themselves, and that, in the end, was enough. The cultists bowed lower, some weeping, some laughing, some too numb to do either. As the exalted turned their gaze outward, those eyes shining, dripping aflame with impossible light swept over the untransformed, their mouths split wide, curved into smiles, too broad for human bone, as though the flesh had stretched just to contain it. The sound of their laughter was like tearing metal, like marrow cracking under a hammer. It was not a question. It was not even a promise. It was a verdict. The lottery was already decided. The hunger began as a whisper. At first, it was easy to mistake for thought some stray fragment of desire, an echo of craving after long fasting. But as nights stretched long in the manufactorum ruins, as the air thickened with incense and promethium fumes, the whisper deepened. It pushed from beneath the skin, like nails dragging along the inside of bone, urging, demanding. And no matter how fiercely the cultists prayed, the voice always returned louder. It spoke of sacrifice, not as choice, but as inevitability. A name given here, a life taken there. Each act was not worship but nourishment, endless feeding that left them emptier with every offering at first. They told themselves it was strength, that the god rewarded their faith with visions so vivid they shook their marrow. But in quiet moments, when the lumen strips guttered low and silence pressed like a shroud, the truth could not be hidden. The visions did not come from beyond. They crawled outward from within. Shapes pressed against their eyes when closed. Shadows writhed across their skin even when no flame was near. And the hunger did not wait. It gnawed at their thoughts until every word spoken was edged with compulsion. Every gesture carried the weight of command that was not theirs. There came a day when they realized prayer no longer mattered. Their mouths moved, yes, and the chants filled the air like smoke, but the devotion had long ago ceased to belong to them. They were not speaking to their God. Their God was speaking through them. And once that revelation sank in, terror settled deeper than faith ever could. Were they worshippers, or were they only shells? hollow vessels carved open for the warp to drink through. The body betrayed them worst of all. Hunger twisted itself into flesh, no longer satisfied with offerings made at altars. Hands shook, not from fear, but from need. Tongues ached with thirst for blood not their own. Veins burned with a fire that could not be cooled, as though molten metal sluiced beneath the skin. Some woke in the dark, with their mouths full of ash, not remembering the prayer they had spoken, or the sacrifice they had made. The hunger had acted while they slept. They understood then that nothing of themselves remained unclaimed. It should have been triumph, yet it was only loss. The old songs of devotion sounded hollow when sung by throats no longer human. The comfort of ritual felt brittle when performed by hands trembling from compulsion. They had wanted power. Instead, they had received prison. For what is a gift, when every day it takes more of what you are, until nothing is left to give? And still, none turned away, because there was no way left to turn to. Their faces already bore marks, not inked by any hand, symbols etched into flesh that shimmered and crawled in the candlelight. Their shadows twisted of their own accord, reaching farther than walls should allow. To abandon now would not return them to what they had been. It would only mean being torn apart by the Inquisition, by their God, or by the hunger itself, so they surrendered. Not with joy, not even with defiance, but with the hollow inevitability of a wave crashing against stone. They let the hunger speak. They let it guide. They let it consume, until the line between flesh and flame blurred entirely. The sound of chanting rose again, but this time it was not their voices. It was the warp itself, singing through mouths that once belonged to men. One cultist, their eyes wide with awe and despair braided into one, lifted a hand before the altar flame. For a heartbeat it was still theirs, scarred, trembling human. Then the skin cracked. Light spilled through. The hand dissolved into molten brilliance. Fingers breaking into strands of searing gold that hissed as they fell like wax upon the stone. They gasped. Not from pain, but from understanding. The gift had finally devoured the giver. And in the silence after, only the hunger remained. Iron chains bit deep into raw flesh. Their links slick with sweat and blood where wrists had struggled in vain. The cell stank of promethium, its fumes clinging to the lungs, thick and suffocating, as though the very air had been steeped in fire long before the torches were lit. Every surface bore the scars of use. Blackened walls from executions past, claw marks etched into stone by those who had refused to die quietly. The Arbites patrolled outside with the precision of war machines, their boots striking in unison, echoing against the iron corridors like a death knell. There was no escape, no corridor unguarded, no plea that could soften the justice of the Imperium. The Inquisitor's gaze was worse than the chains. Cold, unyielding, it dissected the cultists without need of blade or flame. In those pale eyes lingered no hatred, no wrathenly indifference, the certainty of a duty carried out in the Emperor's name. It was not malice that consigned them to the pyres, but ritual necessity. To harbor corruption was to be marked for cleansing, and the fire was not simply punishment, it was purification. The Arbites spoke little. Their movements, the locking of shackles, the careful handling of torches, were themselves liturgies. Every sound seemed rehearsed, every gesture part of a script written thousands of years before, repeated on world after world until it had become indistinguishable from prayer. The cultists tried to pray too, but their words faltered, torn apart by fear. Kneeling in line, bound and broken, they whispered to gods who did not answer, their voices cracked and shallow. Some looked upward, lips trembling with half-remembered catechisms of the ecclesiarchy, grasping for redemption from the very emperor they had betrayed. Others pressed their foreheads to the stone, muttering litanies of chaos that slipped out like venom, more instinct than devotion. Yet the silence between those whispers spoke louder than any prayer, the silence of abandonment, of knowing that no one, neither saint nor demon, would intervene. When the torches were lowered, the world narrowed to firelight. Promethium burned quick and merciless, soaking cloth and hair, devouring flesh faster than the mind could register. Screams rose in chorus, torn torn raw from throats that strained until they ripped. But not all the screams were human. For among the burning, one cultist opened their mouth to release terror. And what poured forth was not a plea, not a cry, but a sound that curdled the marrow of all who heard it, was language. Yes, but not one taught on Terra, nor one sanctioned by any Imperial archive. The syllables slithered, each sound folding in on itself like a wound opening wider, until the vox grills of Arbite's helmets crackled with static as though the air itself recoiled. The words scraped at the walls, left shadows writhing across the stone, and for a moment the flames bent sideways, guttering as though pulled toward the speaker's voice. The Arbites did not falter. Their discipline was absolute, their faith unbreakable. Yet even their measured steps faltered for the briefest second, as though something vast and unseen had looked back at them through the prisoner's throat. The Inquisitor's face did not move, though the pale of their eyes seemed to sharpen, narrowing not in fear but in grim recognition. They had heard such sounds before, in ruins better left unnamed, and knew what it meant. Fire was not enough. Purification would demand more than ash. The cultists convulsed. Chains clattering against stone, the sound almost lost in the roar of burning flesh. The scream became chant. The chant became something like laughter, though no joy lived within it. Their eyes, consumed by flame, still shone with a light not their own, reflecting symbols in the air that no torch should have cast. The pyre became a beacon, and for one dreadful instant, it was as though the Emperor's justice and the god's hunger clashed in the same breath, and then the voice cut off. Not with silence, but with a sound like a door closing in the marrow of the world. Smoke rose. Flesh blackened. Chains sagged loose. But in the hearts of those who watched, a question festered like a wound. If fire cannot silence the whispers, then what can? The torchbearers stood frozen, flames still burning in their hands, the last echoes of the inhuman voice lingering in the stone. And in that stillness, one truth became clear. The execution had not ended anything. It had begun something. The world had narrowed until nothing remained but the heat of fire and the pulse of the warp pressing against flesh. In the dim glow of hidden sanctuaries, the faithful moved as one. Though not by choice, their bodies were conduits now, vessels shaped by devotion that had long since shed the need for thought. Skin rippled with unnatural warmth, muscles twisted into impossible angles. And eyes no longer saw the material world but flickered with visions of impossible geometries. The air tasted metallic, thick with incense, and the lingering copper of blood drawn in countless rites. And yet none of them recoiled. Even nausea had become a memory. Every movement, every tremor of the limb was dictated by a force older than Terra, older than the Emperor's light, pulling at sinew and thought with equal insistence. Whispers no longer needed lips. They came from beneath the skin, a language that made the hair rise along the nape and sent shivers deep into the marrow. The faithful echoed it without hesitation, their voices weaving together into a chorus that both horrified and enthralled. Every chant, once a prayer, had been transformed into compulsion rituals performed without deliberation, sacrifices offered without pause, and devotion that left no room for doubt. The line between will and command had been erased, leaving only obedience that fed the god's hunger. Some cried out in private, trying to reclaim scraps of self, but their voices were drowned by the rising swell of the chorus. A tide of sound and purpose they could no longer resist. In this fevered descent, bodies became canvases and instruments. Flesh grew thick with markings that shifted under candlelight. Lines curling into shapes the mind could not parse, sigils that burned faintly when touched by the warp's energy. Hands that had once held tools or weapons now flexed unnaturally, performing gestures that summoned visions or drew power. The movements at once sacred and grotesque. The faithful's eyes glazed over, reflecting the flicker of firelight and the impossible horizons of the warp superimposed upon the shadowed manufactorum walls. It was awe wrapped in terror. Each moment of power exacted a toll, and the closer they drew to the divine, the more the self evaporated, leaving only an empty vessel brimming with fervor. Some among them ascended, though ascension was no gift, only transformation. Towers of warped muscle and sinew loomed in the corners of shadowed chambers, mouths splitting impossibly wide to pour forth endless incantations. Limbs ended and clawed, shifting forms, veins coursing with promethium and ichor alike. And voices that could shatter stone resonated without effort. To the untransformed, the sight inspired awe, tangled with envy. To the transformed, the sight was simply necessity, each second an exercise in becoming that which they had always served. The line between devotion and annihilation blurred, until neither mattered. Yet for every exalted, there were the forsaken, the bodies that could not sustain the communion. Limbs softened, organs liquefied, faces melted into masks of pain and worship, the faithful reduced to murmuring biomass, gurgling invocations as their essence was claimed. Those who witnessed it could not look away, even as horror gripped their hearts, because the worship demanded witness. Every survival, every manifestation of power, revealed itself as a wound deeper than the last. A reminder that the gift was always the theft of self. The crescendo came with one among the faithful, kneeling in the center of the sanctum. Candlelight danced across their melting visage, the flesh folding into forms that should not exist, eyes reflecting demonic geometries impossible to comprehend. From a mouth now multiple and constantly reshaping, a vow spilled forth, a phrase that could not have existed in any human tongue, and yet sounded with perfect clarity to those present. The walls themselves seemed to tremble as the words echoed, not only through the chamber but deep into the warp. An offering, a surrender, and a declaration of power all at once. In that moment, the boundaries between self, faith, and divinity dissolved, leaving only the hunger, the unending, insatiable hunger that had consumed them entirely. And there, in that flickering, suffocating light, the last spark of identity vanished. Names, faces, thoughts all were swallowed, leaving vessels of will, devoted utterly, irreversibly, and beautifully damned. The faithful no longer knelt. They became the shape of devotion itself, a reflection of a God that demanded more than flesh could contain, a hunger that devoured its servants with the inevitability of eternity. Even after the flames had consumed the last living flesh, the cultists did not vanish, not truly. Ashes settled over the manufactorum floor, swirling in the stagnant air, yet in every nook and hollow, whispers lingered. They were subtle at first, barely perceptible over the hiss of coolant vents and the rhythmic clank of distant servitors. As if the very walls had absorbed memory, each echo carried fragments, snatches of chant, twisted liturgy. Syllables that no human tongue could hold without shivering in fear. In the silence between breaths, the dead murmured back. The cycle had begun again, imperceptibly but inexorably. Corridors once bright with the industrial hum of promethium furnaces now felt like tombs. The shadows themselves, thick with presence. Where an Arbite's patrol had once stomped with authority, only silence now answered. Yet that silence was deceptive. Steps echoed not of boots, but of memory-faint impressions of what had been, stretching out like veins in the stone. Every sigil scorched into walls, every carving etched in desperation or devotion became a seed. Even purging flame could not erase the inked testimonies of heresy. They were written into the manufactorum, as if the stone itself had learned to remember. To reproduce, to whisper, children ran barefoot through the underhive. Their faces streaked with soot and tears, unaware of the histories they tread upon. Their voices repeated words they could not understand, syllables lifted from the mouths of the damned, carried across generations without context. Here, the gift, the hunger. The words tumbled from tiny tongues, innocent yet corrupted, a lullaby folded into nightmare. The cultist had become not a corpse, not a memory, but an echo, a template of warning and temptation intertwined. Each whisper born from fire and warp energy now found a new vessel, invisible and waiting. In the forgotten chambers, the warped instruments of ritual remained. Lumen strips flickered in intermittent rhythm, casting long, wavering shadows across rusted railings and scorched stone. The faint hum of Auspex sensors, long decommissioned, vibrated faintly with residual warp resonance. A single servitor, untouched for decades, twitched, its optic lenses flickering as though sensing the unseen currents of devotion still flowing through the ruins. It was impossible to determine whether it was malfunction or communion. Perhaps the distinction no longer mattered. The cycle did not care. It needed only continuation, propagation, repetition. Whispers began to echo in patterns like a melody buried deep in the void. Each fragment of the cultist's deeds, each act of defiance or surrender, became a warning and a lure. Children, scavengers, and forgotten denizens of the hive block absorbed them unknowingly, playing with words that carried the weight of eternity. Even in death or transformation there was influence, subtle but undeniable, shaping the choices of those who had no inkling of the forces stirring around them. The unbroken cycle, like a dark river, carried seeds of devotion, heresy, and hunger into every shadow, every hablock. Every hollowed-out shrine where the Imperium's light dared not linger. The emotional weight was suffocating, yet impossible to resist. All mingled with terror. The realization struck with the force of a voidquake. There was no true end. Every purged chamber, every pyre built to cleanse, every Arbite's boot that pressed down on ash or stone only ensured that another whisper, another echo, another spark of devotion would bloom in the unseen corners. The cultist had ceased to be a single life. They had become pattern, principle, inevitability. The warp had claimed not only their body and mind, but their presence across time and memory. And yet, even as the manufactorum settled into ghostly silence, the cycle whispered forward. From the far reaches of the underhive came the soft, tentative voice of a child. Barely audible over the hum of failing machinery, the words were clear and impossible. The hunger. It waits. There was no teacher, no overheard rituals. Only the residue of 1,000 devotions passed through ash and shadow, echoing until it found ears willing to hear. That phrase, innocent in form but corrupted in essence, carried the first trace of what would inevitably grow into the next heresy. The next bloom of devotion, the next cycle without end. The child's footsteps receded, but the words lingered, vibrating in the air like unseen currents of promethium smoke. Somewhere deeper in the hive, new shapes began to stir, drawn by voices that had long outlived the original flesh. The manufactorum itself seemed to breathe, inhaling the whispers, exhaling possibilities. And through it all, the cultist's presence endured not in bone or blood, not in flesh, but in echo, legend and seed, eternal as the void, and just as hungry.